So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today. My name is Natasha Overdoon. I work jointly for the POLIS project on ecological governance and the Center for Indigenous Environmental Resources. And I am co-hosting this webinar with the First Nations Fisheries Council. So some of you would have heard about this webinar from Geneviève and the Council, and some of you might have heard about it through the POLIS networks. However you got here, we're really glad that you can join us, and we're looking forward to the discussion. Before we get started, I want to say a thank you to our funders and our supporters who are making these types of sessions possible. So the Real Estate Foundation of BC and also the Sitka Foundation have contributed to making today's event possible. And also the folks at the University of Victoria and the Centre for Global Studies. A few things before we begin that I want to mention. In terms of audio, I have a mute on everybody so that we don't have everybody's feedback. But for questions, we'll use the chat box. So you can type in your questions either during or after the presentations, and then in the question period, I'll read those out and the speakers can answer them. And before we get started with our introductions, I want to just acknowledge that I'm bringing this webinar to you live from the traditional territory of the Ktunaxa Nation, Ktunaxa. And when you introduce yourself, I'd welcome you to tell us where you're calling in from, what the weather's like, and also the traditional territory that you're on while you're listening. I'm really delighted to introduce our speakers today, and we have three really fabulous speakers, as well as our co-host, Geneviève, on the line. So I'll just give Geneviève a moment to say hello before I introduce our other speakers.
Hi, can you hear me, Natasha?
Yes, I sure can.
Hi, everybody. This is Geneviève Leighton Cartier. I work here at the First Nations Fisheries Council of BC. We have a fisheries program here, but we also have a freshwater program. And I am the project coordinator here, and the manager is Susie Porter-Bopp, which some of you may know from her previous positions at other organizations. And I'm really excited to be here. We're calling from, Susie's on the line as well, and we're calling from Vancouver, but traditionally known as the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories. The weather is quite gray, but spring is on its way. So welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Geneviève. Awesome. Okay, so I'll give you a quick introduction to each of our speakers, who all, by the way, have some of the nicest bio pictures that I've ever seen. So Heather Leschied is here today, and Heather has been involved in community-based watershed monitoring and stewardship in the Columbia Basin for over 10 years. So she's bringing a wide breadth of experience to today's discussion. And Heather works as a program director for Living Lakes Canada with individuals and groups to build knowledge really around implementing citizen science monitoring programs and informing policy in order to better protect our watersheds. And Heather is chair of the Kootenay Lake Partnership and also the East Kootenay Integrated Lake Management Partnership. And so through these roles has been involved in sensitive habitat inventory mapping projects for 13 lakes in BC, Alberta, and Manitoba. And Heather's also a student, so we really appreciate that she can be here today during this busy time. We also have Nicole Copell on the line today. Nicole is the Environment and Archaeological Stewardship Manager for the Ktunaxa Nation Council. She has an education in anthropology from Trent University and is also currently enrolled in a Master of Arts in Environment and Management at Royal Roads University. And Nicole has worked as an archaeological consultant for the past 13 years in Belize, Central America, Northern BC, and Alberta, and now works in Ktunaxa territory. And she's been with the Ktunaxa Nation Council since 2010. And finally, we have Sangeeta Sudan on the line, and she's the General Manager of Development Services at the Regional District of Central Kootenay. Sangita has been a planner since 2001 with the province of BC, and she joined the RDCK in 2010. and she has a wide number of responsibilities, including overseeing several services, land use planning, park planning, GIS, community sustainability, building inspection, bylaw enforcement, and the Kootenay Lake Local Conservation Service. So a lot of practical knowledge on how to get things done. And some notable achievements include her hands-on experience working with First Nations and multi-stakeholder organizations to develop land use policies, partnerships, and projects, such as Kootenay Lake Partnership, which we are going to talk about today. And Sangita lives on Kootenay Lake, where she likes to garden, cook, and is an aspiring writer, currently working on her first novel about female pirates. So it's great to know that fun fact. So with that, I'll hand things over to the speakers. I will mute myself, and the speakers can press *6 and advance their slides and share their journey. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. I'm Heather Leschied, as Natasha introduced, and of course also we have Nicole and Sangita on the line as well. And we do have a joint PowerPoint presentation that we're going to give, and so we'll be handing it off amongst us, but I will get us started. So today we're going to share the story of the Kootenay Lake Partnership, which is actually quite a long story, and it's really wonderful to share it with you all today. I'm just going to check that I can advance slides. Great. So the Kootenay Lake Partnership was formed in 2010 as a result of a clear need for coordinated, balanced management approaches that would sustain environmental, community, recreational, Aboriginal, cultural, traditional, and aesthetic values for the lake. The mission of the partnership was modeled after the East Kootenay Integrated Lake Management Partnership, which was formed by Fisheries and Oceans Canada in 2006. But the Kootenay Lake Partnership is very unique. It operates solely as a multi-agency initiative. It's a government-to-government approach between local, regional, provincial, federal, and First Nations governments. Kootenay Lake, for those who aren't aware, is located in southeastern British Columbia. The major city center here is Nelson, which has a population of approximately 10,000. However, the rural areas surrounding the lake have a total population of about 60,000. Kootenay Lake is part of the Kootenay River system, which is a tributary of the Columbia River. So here on the map, we've highlighted the Kootenay River watershed, and the box overlays Kootenay Lake specifically. The Kootenay River begins at the headwaters north of Kootenay National Park in the Rocky Mountains and flows south across the Montana border where the Libby Dam formed Ktunaxa Reservoir in 1972. The river makes a bend north again and crosses the Idaho border near Creston, BC, where it becomes Kootenay Lake. While Kootenay Lake is a natural lake, water levels are controlled through operations at the Shoreline Dam downstream. But it's important to note the geographic focus area of the Kootenay Lake Partnership, which is the west arm to Shoreline Dam where Nelson lies, the north arm to the mouth of the Duncan River, the south arm to the mouth of the Kootenay River, and for our study purposes is includes the foreshore to 100 meters inland or a logical physical break such as the highway. The Kootenay Lake Partnership was brought together originally by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, but it's a large partnership. It includes representation from the Regional District of Central Kootenay, Ministry of Forests and Lands and Natural Resource Operations, Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, Interior Health Authority, the Ktunaxa Nation Council, the Yakanuki, or otherwise known as Lower Kootenay Band in Creston, the City of Nelson, and the Village of Kaslo. And I also think it's important to note where our financial contributions come from. That the partnership itself, members of the partnership itself support the partnership financially, and we also receive grants through the Columbia Basin Trust, the Real Estate Foundation of BC, and Vancouver Foundation, and also have financial support from Fortis BC and Tech, which is not listed here. And I would also add a recent contribution from the newly formed Kootenay Lake Local Conservation Fund, which is a service provided by the Regional District of Central Kootenay. So why we formed? Fisheries and Oceans Canada completed a foreshore inventory and mapping project for the west arm of Kootenay Lake, which is about 30 kilometers long, in 2004. And they completed one again in 2008, so 4 years later. Within that short time frame, the level of impact of the shoreline increased, the amount of land designated as urban residential increased, and there was a net loss in riparian vegetation. In addition to that, 300 new docks and groins were built within that 4-year period. And the Kootenay Lake Partnership was created because of this recognized and documented increase in development pressures on Kootenay Lake. At the same time, we were seeing overlapping multi-jurisdictional responsibilities across government agencies and subsequent cumulative impacts specifically raised by Yakanuki and Ktunaxa Nation and the public. Unfortunately, this is a common story across many lakes in BC and elsewhere in Canada, where we have conflicting policy, poor communication, uncoordinated efforts, lack of regulatory compliance, and weak public education and guidance. And of course, this can result in long-term environmental damage to the foreshore and the lake. On Kootenay Lake specifically, we see extensive impacts from structures built along the shoreline. And it was further identified that many alterations had proceeded without appropriate permits or approvals in place. And often these activities are not in compliance with best management practices. So some of what we see on Kootenay Lake includes beach grooming, clearing vegetation in riparian areas, modification of spawning habitats, specifically for kokanee, and building structures that alter the shoreline, such as retaining walls or groins. In order to address these cumulative impacts, and I'm sorry, the slide is showing on my screen not very clearly, but I'll walk you through it a little bit. So the partnership addressed the need to recognized the need to address these cumulative impacts. And the approach the partnership decided to take was to complete a sensitive habitat inventory mapping project for the entire lake. So sensitive habitat inventory mapping, or otherwise known as SHIM, is comprised of the foreshore inventory, which I talked about earlier, and an aquatic habitat index. The resulting shoreline management guidelines help to contribute to a better understanding of ecological values of the lake and direct shoreline development in a manner to protect those values. The methodology for sensitive habitat inventory mapping was developed by Fisheries and Oceans Canada and has been modified over the years depending on the lake that's being studied. But we recognize that SHIM traditionally is really just one component of a larger lake management planning process that can identify how our communities want to live, work, recreate, and develop in and around our lakes. The Kootenay Lake Partnership has taken a unique and precedent-setting approach to this federal protocol and has integrated cultural and archaeological values alongside ecological values. So you can see on the slide we have our ecological values on the left in the green box, our archaeological and cultural values identified in the middle in the yellow box, and community values identified on the right. And we work in partnership with Friends of Kootenay Lake Stewardship Society, who have completed an incredible community values survey to help us understand what those values are specific to Kootenay Lake. We'll walk through the process a little bit. So to break it down, the first step, the foreshore inventory mapping, assists in identifying land use, shore type, existing riparian conditions, and anthropogenic alterations, such as marinas, docks, retaining walls, or even bridges. Based on this data, the shoreline is broken down into a number of segments. The foreshore inventory mapping serves as a benchmark for regulatory agencies by documenting current foreshore conditions. It provides evidence for regulatory investigations as well as photo documentation. Secondly, the Aquatic Habitat Index uses scientific data collection to identify zones of sensitivity and key habitat features. It essentially ranks shoreline segments. Fish and wildlife data is collected during the summer and fall over a 1-year period using various field assessment protocols. And the Aquatic Habitat Index quantifies the ecological value for each shoreline segment and also identifies the potential if alterations were to be removed. So this is a really exciting piece of sensitive habitat inventory mapping because we can identify priority areas for restoration. Similar projects have been completed for many lakes across the Kootenay, including Kootenay Lake and 9 other lakes in the East Kootenay. And currently, Ktunaxa Reservoir is one of our major projects underway. The East Kootenay lakes have been led by the East Kootenay Integrated Lake Management Partnership. And I want to note that in each case, each lake and community is unique. And so each process is a little bit different. But the commonality is that the resulting shoreline management guidelines have been adopted by government or implemented into lake management plans, official community plans, or other zoning processes. And they're used during the development, application, and referral process. But what's really exciting about Kootenay Lake is that for the first time, archaeological and cultural values have been incorporated into the Shoreline Guidance document. And I'll hand it over to Nicole to walk us through these components.
Thanks, Heather. I'll just start my slideshow here. Before I start, I just also wanted to say thank you to POLIS and the First Nations Fisheries Council for setting this up. And I wanted to acknowledge that Kootenay Lake and the West Arm also shares their territory with the Shquatum, some of the Shquatum communities, the Okanagan, and the Sinixt people as well. So for the purpose of the presentation that I'm doing around cultural values, the cultural values study that we did for the Shoreline Guidance document was specifically Ktunaxa cultural values, and there are other nations who have cultural values and interests in the Kootenay Lake study area who may or may not be doing their own value study, and that's open as well. And we recognize that there are many different nations that have used this area for a very long time. So the first slide I have up here just shows a little bit of what the Ktunaxa refer to as Ktunaxa Amakas, which is their homeland or their territory. In British Columbia, it's 70,000 square kilometers. It also extends traditionally into Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Alberta. And the Ktunaxa refer to, they have traditional land districts that are related to their creation story, which are shown kind of on the left side here. And the Kootenay Lake study area for this project is in Utsuamakas, which is the land of the wolverine. Okay, so just a little bit about the cultural values study, and Heather touched a bit on why the Ktunaxa were interested in this partnership particularly, and then also wanting to include archaeological and cultural value into management planning because so many impacts have happened in this on this lake, including the creation of the dams. We do have a picture here of Grand Coulee Dam because that one in itself impacted the Ktunaxa territory in that it blocked the passage of anadromous salmon to Ktunaxa territory, and currently also the oral, cultural, and archaeological records show fishing of salmon in their territory along the Columbia River and the Kootenay River up to Bonington Falls. The Ktunaxa no longer have access to salmon in their traditional territory. So starting with that impact back in the 1930s, cumulatively the amount of impact, as Heather touched on, over the past 80 years has been a concern to Ktunaxa people. So the Ktunaxa Nation Council, just a little bit of background, we represent 4 Ktunaxa communities in Canada, one being Yakaniki, the Lower Kootenay Band in Creston, which is on the south end of the lake. We have our vision statement up here, and our vision statement is very holistic, looking at people, culture, land, and governance, which I think is very reflected in what the Kootenay Lake Partnership has done in terms of developing the Shoreline Guidance document to include the ecological, cultural, ecological, environmental, cultural, and social aspects of lake management. So the cultural values study took place over about 2 years, and the way that we did this was first we did some mapping, and we did mapping based on current and living memory use of the area, as well as oral history, archival research, ethnographic research, etc. And then the knowledge holders and the land users came out with us onto the lake, and we identified
specific areas and went to specific areas to see if they're still kind of in the same shape as what people remember them as, or to like actually define and locate areas on the lake. And so the criteria for the cultural value components were we looked at archaeological values, ecological, and then we also looked at use areas such as trails or habitation areas, harvesting areas. We looked at kind of, there's a really interesting system in the South Arm, that a diking system that has really impacted the wetlands. So we looked a lot at the wetlands and the historic flow patterns down there. We looked at one of the biggest things that was a concern for Ktunaxa people was the access to the lake based on development pressures, and where people used to be able to access the lake in order to fish or to even get in their boat and go across to look at areas. They aren't able to do that anymore. People are throwing up fences and private property signs, and we're not really knowing what's going on there. So those were some of the criteria we used to map cultural values, and then we internally developed management planning for those values, and then externally kind of shared areas with that have gone into this guidance document that show areas that we have specific cultural value, and then we have management planning that we want to engage either with government or developers to talk about how we incorporate management or mitigation into the application. This is just an example of some of the sites. There are several pictograph sites along the shoreline, and I just want to mention that we did get permission to show this slide from our Elders Committee, and it shows just a part of the connection that Ktunaxa have in that there are oral histories specifically linked to this pictograph site. Just a couple more pictures of some of the people who participated in the project, and that includes in the top, and in the top right is the person driving the boat, Kenton Andrushek. He's a member of the Kootenay Lake Partnership, and he does a lot of compliance and enforcement work for the Ktunaxa Nation. So it was important for him to be out with the knowledge holders in order to get a sense of what they hold dear and what they want him to do as a part of his job. An interesting piece of the field work is that this is a location where they got off the boat and wanted to talk about. It was an area where there was really good fishing, and Ktunaxa people know this area is a great fishing location. And in the top above, the gentleman in the green, and above his head it says no. There's a sign that says no camping, which is pretty funny because one of our elders said, no, this is the place that we've been camping for since he was a kid. And then while he was talking about the place, one of the other knowledge holders went over and picked up a rock, and it just so happens to be an archaeological artifact. And so this artifact in particular, it's made of Kootenay argillite. It's a biface thinning flake, and from what I can tell, I actually haven't seen it in person yet, but it probably dates to around 2,500 years ago. That's when the quarry for Kootenay argillite was used. That quarry is located on Kootenay Lake, up in the mountains just behind it. And so it's really interesting to know that, as we went out and did this study, the areas where Ktunaxa have used and continue to use the foreshore date back thousands of years. So we thought that was a really interesting part of the fieldwork that we did. So moving into the archaeological values mapping, because archaeological, as most of the people I think on the call know, archaeological work, I guess, in the province is overseen through the Heritage Conservation Act and the Archaeology branch. And so there's a specific type of permitting process and impact assessment process defined by the province when you want to take out development permits. And so we thought that we'd separate this out from the cultural value study and do a study specifically for archaeology that fits a bit more in with the provincial guidelines. And so we worked very closely with the people that did the ecological shoreline study, and we used the same shoreline segments that were used by that study because they were
broken out in landform type and substrate type, and so it worked for archaeological potential. We did some field work and overview assessment, and we identified each segment, we identified archaeological potential within that segment, and then we looked at activities that could happen within the foreshore, and we identified what the risk that activity has of impacting archaeological sites and material within that shoreline segment. So that's the way that we did the archaeological study. And I'm just going to, I think, or maybe, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to take this part of the presentation because usually someone else does it and he's not on the line right now. So I'll continue, but Heather, jump in if I'm not supposed to talk about this.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Okay, thanks. So then I just wanted to touch a little bit on enforcement, and that's what the private sign, do not read, is all about. And so a lot of what we see moving forward with this guidance document is looking at compliance and enforcement and working with the province and hopefully one day with DFO again and with the Ktunaxa Nation, including CRIFIC and other nations if they are involved in looking at compliance and enforcement of the guidance document. And again, while the crew, this is the part of the crew that were out doing the cultural values study, and while they were out there, they did see some things that they want, that Kenton, who is trained to do this type of compliance and enforcement work, he's a fisheries guardian with DFO. He did notice some things and was talking to people, but basically this is our boat. It belongs to the Ktunaxa Nation Council, and it's one of the only boats that does compliance and enforcement. I think the province has one boat and Okanagan Nation Alliance have a boat, and so you can imagine we only get a couple of days out on this lake that it has a shoreline that's over 200 kilometers long. DFO did close their office in Nelson quite a few years ago, so we don't have any compliance and enforcement from them. And so while they were doing field work for the cultural values study, this shot came from that group, and Kenton noticed someone was on the beach with his a little tiny backhoe, and Kenton said, "I don't think that guy has a permit." So he went over and chatted with him, and he didn't have a permit. He was gathering gravel to I think help his neighbor with rebuilding his gravel driveway or something like that. And Kenton, through the DFO Fisheries Guardian program, he's been trained to do this kind of approach where it's more like outreach and education, and just notifying him that you need a permit, you're not allowed to dig gravel on the shoreline without one, and maybe he shouldn't be doing that. And I guess right after they started to pull away from the shoreline, the gentleman had packed everything up and had left, and it seemed to have worked out anyway, that we had a boat on the shoreline, and they did some compliance work, so that was good. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to Heather, and I guess we'll leave questions for afterwards.
Great, thanks, Nicole. So I just want to note that the original ecological studies were actually completed in 2013. And at that time, the Yakanuki asked that the Shoreline Guidance document be put on hold until the archaeological and cultural values components could be complete and integrated. And we wanted to do this as a partnership to ensure that the confidentiality of the cultural data would be upheld. And so each of these accomplishments have taken us, over the last 4 years. So we're really pleased and proud to be where we are today, having completed the Kootenay Lake scoping study, which helped direct all of this work, the foreshore inventory mapping, the Aquatic Habitat Index, the Archaeological Overview Assessment, Cultural Value Study, and now, today, the completion of the Shoreline Guidance document. The intent of the Shoreline Guidance document is to allow common, low-risk activities to proceed with minimal application requirements. But where there are higher-risk activities, specific design, detailed design, and assessment information is required. The guidelines are intended to protect and restore important fish and wildlife habitat and archaeological and cultural values. The document outlines steps necessary for these works to be considered by identifying permitting requirements of Crown lands, federal and provincial government agency requirements as well. And from here, there's an opportunity to incorporate the guidelines into official community plans, zoning bylaws, and other planning opportunities. And I want to mention as well that we recognize that the state of the shoreline does change over time, and we do have plans to go back and resurvey this lake after about 5 years. So we're going to start by walking through an example, and we want to show you what this mapping looks like and how it can be applied. So here is a piece of mapping that's located at Coffee Creek, which is on the north arm of the lake, the west shore. If you were driving from Nelson, you would head toward Cavlo. Coffee Creek is just south of Ainsworth. So you can see here that the shoreline is divided into segments. So the segment number is located in the white text, number 50. Segment breaks are the white diamonds. The segment breaks are based on shore type, level of shoreline disturbance, forest cover, substrate, and a number of other factors. Of the total length of shoreline, so for Kootenay Lake, it's actually 400 kilometers of shoreline, we have 254 segments overall. Each segment is color-coded for Aquatic Habitat Index, which is identified at the top on the right, shoreline sensitivity, so are there aquatic or environmental site sensitivities present, and cultural importance and archaeological values as well. I'll just make note that shoreline sensitivities really identify some specific areas such as shore spawning kokanee, other areas for sturgeon, and potentially osprey nesting sites, features like that. In those cases, a qualified environmental professional will likely be required to support submission of the document or of the application. So we'll walk through an example here at Coffee Creek. So you can see that the Aquatic Habitat Index ranks Coffee Creek as very high, so the thin red line on the left-hand side. This area is a stream mouth. It provides valuable habitat for fish, and it's an important link between the lake and the upland. The aquatic and environmental site sensitivities are also identified as both being present, so we have that green color there, the second line in. Our cultural engagement is identified as yes or enhanced, so purple, and archaeological values are identified as brown zone. So to understand what all of these colors mean, the document sends us first to the activity risk table. This is an example of what the activity risk table looks like. The entire table actually includes a number of activities, but to try to keep it simple and make it easy to see on the presentation, we've cut out this one example of aquatic vegetation removal. But many other activities take place on the shoreline, such as dredging, beach creation, erosion control, such as retaining walls, boat launches, mooring buoys, marinas, water lines, docks, lots of activities here. But again, we've only displayed aquatic vegetation for simplicity. We'll use the example of non-native aquatic invasive species vegetation removal, the second row down. So remember that the mapping showed the aquatic habitat rank as very high, and the rating for removing non-native aquatic vegetation is also very high, identified here. The Shoreline Guidance document then outlines, through a decision-making flowchart, which steps to take to proceed with such a project. This may include significant efforts to ensure prevention of harm through relocation, redesign, mitigation, or compensation measures for the activity. The activity risk table also identifies further approvals which are required. Further detail is included in the report in terms of how to go about submitting an application through Front Counter BC to deal with Crown Land Tenures, Water Sustainability Act, and the Fisheries and Oceans Canada federal approval requirements. If the area in question was identified as very low, for example, and was in a purple section, removing non-native aquatic plants would be considered a low risk and could proceed with less oversight, such as the requirement to follow best management practices. So next, we'll take a look at the archaeological risk table. So if you remember that the mapping identified our shoreline segment as a brown zone, so removing invasive aquatic vegetation is considered a low archaeological risk activity. Low archaeological risk implies that the action is not likely to alter natural materials deposited and therefore would not impact archaeological materials or features. This could also mean that the action is to take place where past disturbance has already altered the site beyond the capacity of an archaeological investigation, so no assessment or action would be required. But if the activity were to be deemed a very high risk, the proponent must contact a consulting archaeologist to conduct an in-field assessment. The last table that we'll take a look at is the cultural values table. This determines the appropriate level of engagement based on cultural importance. The area is culturally important. If you remember that the shoreline segment was identified as purple. The removal of invasive aquatic vegetation requires a standard level of engagement. For this case, applications in standard engagement areas should be submitted to the appropriate regulatory agency and also referred to the Ktunaxa Nation Council as per standard practice. The Shoreline Guidance document provides further guidance for these steps. And if the activity were to be required enhanced engagement, there may be a high risk of infringing on Ktunaxa rights. In many cases, activities with high risk to Ktunaxa cultural values are unlikely to be supported unless mitigations or specific work procedures are agreed to, implemented, and monitored. So now that the Shoreline Guidance document is complete, the Kootenay Lake Partnership will be holding outreach workshops over the coming months, beginning with government agency managers, conservation officers, and Front Counter BC. Phase 2 of our outreach will include environmental consultants, real estate agents, industry, such as heavy equipment operators. And Phase 3 will include local residents and second homeowners, shoreline property owners as well, of course. The final piece being integration with policy and enforcement. So I want to mention that we just walked through one small example and that the document is quite extensive. There's a lot of really interesting information available for our community and decision makers to help guide development in a way to protect ecological, cultural, and archaeological values on Kootenay Lake. We're really grateful to be able to speak today. I also want to point out we have a couple members of the partnership on the phone. So we're happy to take questions and further engage in dialogue.
Great. Thank you, Heather and Nicole. It was really useful to get that walkthrough of how this process works. And Nicole, I also really appreciated the images and the detail that you shared. That was extremely useful to paint a picture of this initiative. So I welcome everyone on the line to put their questions in the chat box, and I can read them out. And while we're waiting for folks, I had one question for Sangita, and I wanted to give her a chance to kind of reflect on the presentation. Sangita, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit from your perspective as a senior local government staff person, what the value of this partnership is in terms of complementing local government policy, and if you had any kind of recommendations for government folks on the line, how they might begin organizing this kind of initiative in their home watershed.
Well, I think for local government, the benefit is about building the relationships. Primarily, that was the first thing that we recognized is the relationship we were building not only with the provincial staff there, but also with the Ktunaxa Nation. And at the time, we had an Okanagan Nation representative at the table as well. And then going forward, because this process has been so collaborative, engaging with our area directors who have supported the process from its beginning, engaging the area directors when we go to policy review and make recommendations based on the information that we've gathered through this project on Kootenay Lake will be, hopefully the result will be further protection of those values and recognition of those values going forward into the future.
Thanks. There's a question here from Lynn Palmer. She's wondering, can we obtain this guide or methodology? Is it on a website? And maybe a bigger question related to that is if, Nicole and Heather, you had thoughts on kind of where a First Nations government might need to start to get this type of initiative going and to do these types of assessments.
Excellent question. I could speak to the availability of some of the methodology for sure. As I mentioned, sensitive habitat inventory mapping really was a methodology developed by Fisheries and Oceans Canada. It was originally created for river systems and it was modified over time for lakes. There's been a lot of great work done in the Okanagan region on lakes as well. And there actually is a methodology guide document that was written by Brad Mason and others who at the time were working with Fisheries and Oceans Canada. I think the date was maybe 2002 or 2003. That information is available online. It's something that we can make available on the Kootenay Lake Partnership website, which has just recently been rebuilt. So stay tuned for that. But a simple Google search for sensitive habitat inventory mapping, you'd find that methodology. But again, that document only incorporates ecological values. And so in terms of a broader guide, I would let Nicole speak about the other components.
Yeah, so the archaeological overview assessment methodology that we used is one that was developed by a consultant. His name is Wayne Choquette. He's been working in the Upper Columbia drainage for he just told me on the weekend, it's been 50 years this coming field season, so quite a long time. However, the methodology is based on that methodology put out by the provincial archaeology branch, and so most consulting archaeologists in British Columbia develop a similar archaeological overview assessment methodology, and what we did was we kind of modified that to fit into this guidance document and mapping process. So it's you can find that type of methodology on the archaeology branch website, or when the guidance document is completed and up on our website, we do have a certain amount of the methodology written into the guidance document as well. As for the cultural values study, again, it was something that the Ktunaxa Nation Council, we took pieces of cultural values, I guess, assessment methodology from various places to kind of fit specifically within, not only within this environment and to fit within the guidance document, but then also that really resonates with Ktunaxa people and how they want to talk about their culture and their values and stewardship of those values. And so I think that that's something, we worked with a few different consultants, John Cathro out of Caslow and the Firelight Group out of Victoria, and then we also worked a little bit with this concept of high conservation valued forests, and then we applied it to Kootenay Lake foreshore, kind of interestingly. So as in terms of that, I think it's really something that you can take pieces of different kind of cultural values work that you've done, whether it's traditional use or traditional ecological knowledge, use and occupancy mapping, or stewardship plans or land use plans, and kind of put it together to fit within this specific like lake foreshore mapping process. And for Ktunaxa, instead of specifically saying, oh yes, this is an area where someone where a spiritual value is, they don't want that kind of mapped. I'm sure most nations don't, and so
instead of putting that on the map, what we did was we just have areas where we want enhanced engagement, and that could be for several reasons. And then we have steps through our strategic engagement process as to what enhanced engagement means and how you would contact us. And then internally, we would have all of the information that backs up that segment as to why it was deemed culturally important and what management steps we would take with the person who had contacted us.
Thanks, Nicole. That's really, really useful clarification.
Yeah, I would add that, I mean, generally, it's not a one-size-fits-all. I mean, to summarize, I think what Nicole and I have said, that there's bits and pieces that we've pulled together to build the Shoreline Guidance document for Kootenay Lake. I think if another community and watershed wanted to embark on a similar project, I would certainly encourage contacting the Kootenay Lake Partnership to provide mentorship. I think we could help in that light to share our lessons for sure.
And I just wanted to add to that, the process of establishing the partnership was a learning in itself, and just to get all the players to align our interests was actually not that difficult, but how to take the approach was very interesting. And one other thing that I want to say that the Kootenay Lake Partnership enabled and created with partnerships with other stewardship groups is we established the Friends of Kootenay Lake, working with Living Lakes Canada as well as West Kootenay Eco Society, and some at-large scientists who worked with us to create what is now the Kootenay Lake, the Friends of Kootenay Lake Society. And at that time, we did not have a cohesive group on the lake to represent stewardship initiatives, and now we do.
Thanks, Sangita. And I saw that my colleague Rosie in Victoria is typing a question. Genevieve, I wanted to give you and Susie a chance to ask a question as well from your end. Okay, great.
I think it was a very comprehensive presentation. So right at this time, we don't have any other questions.
Okay, thanks, Genevieve. There's a question here from Rosie. She's asking, what has been the response from the province so far in terms of permitting and enforcement? And that's probably, that would be a good question for all the speakers. Maybe, Nicole, did you want to provide a response? And Kristen Murphy is on the line. Kristen, if you would be able to provide some thoughts on that as well, and just a reminder of who you are and your involvement in the partnership, that would be great.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Kristen is on the line. She should probably answer that.
We'll give Kristen a moment to respond. It looks like she's typing there. But yeah, that is, enforcement was something that you talked about, Nicole. And Kristen, you press *6 to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so in terms of enforcement, I think that the Canadian Columbia River Intertribal Fisheries Commission, or CRIFIC, and they work very closely with the Ktunaxa Nation Council as well as Secwepemc communities, and they do a lot of enforcement work with, and they do that in partnership with DFO and the province. And so I think, I know on the East Kootenay side, where we have these lake management, or these shoreline guidance documents have been in place for about 5 or 6 years, it has really helped with enforcement because it gives a good snapshot of the current condition, and then you can kind of be out on the land and looking at that against the condition, the current condition that we had mapped out. So.
Hi there, it's Kristen Murphy. I'm with Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations in Nelson. I'm a habitat biologist, and I participated in the foreshore inventory mapping for Kootenay Lake. In regards to enforcement, I think actually Nicole just gave an excellent sort of overview of how it's sort of used. It gives you a snapshot in time, so you can identify, you can use the mapping to identify, say, structures that have been permitted and what hasn't been permitted. So if there's ever a question, you've got that sort of scientifically defensible snapshot in time. So it can be used. We haven't used it too much in the West Kootenays for that particular use, but as for permitting, we are sort of incorporating that foreshore inventory overview and the guidelines or the shoreline guidance documents into our assessments when we start looking at Section 11s or land referrals.
And can you just tell us, Kristen, a little bit more about Section 11s for those who don't know what that is?
Under the new Water Sustainability Act, which was implemented in, I think it was February 29th of 2016. That's it's a water approval, so it's a application through the province to do works on Crown foreshore. It's under the previous Water Act, it was Section 9, which people may be more familiar with.
Thanks, and thanks for jumping in to answer that question. That's really useful. Great. Well, we should probably begin to wrap up today. I'll just, if anyone does have any final questions, now's the time to ask them. But we have been on the line for an hour, and I know people need to get back to their various jobs. So thank you, a huge thank you to all of the speakers for sharing their knowledge and for sharing their role in this process and helping all of us better understand it and know how we might be able to scale this out to other parts of the province. This is extremely useful. And a thank you also
very much to POLIS.
Yeah, and thanks to Genevieve for co-hosting as well.
And yeah.
Wonderful.
Thanks, Natasha and Rosie and everybody and speakers. Yeah, great presentation today, and wishing everybody a really good day.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Much appreciated. Have a great day.